What's up, guys? Your boy Van Kill Gaming here, dropping another hot video for you guys. The topic for today's video is actually a pretty important one. Why arena fighters don't show up at EVO. Play my intro. This is actually a small part of a consequence of a bigger issue, which in reality is why are arena fighters not part of the FGC or esports community? As a prevalent gamer myself, played lots of different kinds of games growing up. Now, mostly focusing on fighting games, but when I was a lot younger, I actually prefer the button mashing nonsense that you would call this. And I was an active fan of games that looked like this. But the reality of the situation is that as I got more invested into competitive fighting games, as I became a member of the FGC and started to see the beauties of competition and trials and overcoming and getting stronger, games like the ones we just showed just kind of dropped out of the limelight for me. And the real question here is what happened, right? What changed? What made it to where I no longer wanted to engage in those games or play them seriously, competitively, XYZ? And if that's the case for me, what makes that also the case for others? And that's what we're going to talk about today. First, we have to address the biggest question here, of course, and a lot of people are going to look at me funny, but what is a fighting game? Well, in layman's terms, a fighting game, or in simplest terms, a fighting game is an action game that usually includes a 1 versus 1 scenario where 2 players control the movements of a character and use attacks to deliver damage to some sort of health system, and the win player who deals the most damage and depletes the opponent's health wins. Now, technically, if you have a one-on-one shooting game where you use attacks, right? The attacks are usually more physical based than projectiles, although there are projectile characters. But it's hard to define all these things because some games go out of the norm but still fall under a certain category of games. So, the easiest way is just a game where 2 characters fight each other until a knockout occurs. That's the basic, easiest way to define it. There's lots of different variations of that playset, but that's the most basic one. So what is not a fighting game? Non-fighting games are shooters because the objective is not to use frame data and tools like that to your advantage to beat your opponent, but just to deal more shots, land more bullets. So that doesn't really fall into the category. Most first single player experience action games also don't fall into this category for lots of other reasons. But it's easy to define what's not a fighting game unless you're falling under some communities that say Smash Brothers is a fighting game, yada yada yada, which I'm not going to get into today. But the real question, now that we've answered what a fighting game is what gets a game to show up at Evolution? There's lots of categories and lots of defining traits that allow games to end up at EVO. 1, competition. 2, there has to be an audience, and 3, hype. I mean, the game has to have some form of hype. It has to have something that brings people in to watch, and something that can be elevated past just a casual experience, usually. So, if some fighting games end up as esports friendly or FGC friendly, what are the criteria that some of those games share? Well, the first is, usually from fighting game perspective, most fighting games that end up at EVO are 2D, with a couple exceptions. 2D or 2.5D, being that the characters can only move left to right, they have health bars, and your objective is to knock your opponent's health down to 0. Yeah, it's typical space with Smash Brothers being kind of an exception with part of it, but it's still 2.5D, right? You're not moving into any third dimensions of movement. So generally, if you see a 2.5D or 2D fighting game, that's considered esports friendly off the bat. There are usually not arguments about whether the game is esports friendly or not, just depending on how much depth and technicality it takes to play the game. So we can get into other issues of that nature. There are also 3D games. Now, 3D games are kind of a myriad or a bridge between what I'm proposing or talking about in this video and 2D games. Now, most people call them 3D, but the reality is that they're more similar to 2D with capacity to move through back and forth through the Z-axis. Not freely, but the capacity is there. That's the thing. You have the capacity to move to the Z-axis, but it's not necessarily 100% there. So games like this are Tekken, Soul Calibur, right? In most cases, you still face your opponent. It's still most of your movement is still left and right. Whereas in Tekken, in more advanced situations, you do add, like a sidestep here and there for whatever the situation requires. But in most cases, it's still technically 2D, or it's still 2D in a way. You just have that third dimension of movement that adds something to the gameplay. Now, what do arena fighters have that could make them new, that could bring a fresh face to the FGC or esports in general? What do they share? What are the ideas that kind of center around that? Well, arena fighters, unlike most other fighting games, have the potential to have the craziest movement or movement ideas of any fighting game ever, if you think about it. Because your character exists in an arena, right? The capacity to move in a full 360-degree realm circularly really changes the potential outcomes or situations that arise in gameplay. This also leads to the potential for more mix-up scenarios and mix-up type ideas that haven't been explored in 2D or 2.5D or the semi-3D games like Tekken and Soul Calibur. Visual representation in an arena fighter could also bring a new level of fidelity and hype to what is already a pretty fascinating concept of competition already. So the next question here is, if there's a potential for all this stuff, right, and the games generally follow some of the same rules, right? Health bars, 2 characters, 1v1. There's, what exactly is the issue? What's causing arena fighters to not get the limelight that they deserve? And the answer is very simple. In short or long, there's a handful of factors that keep arena fighters back or pull them away from the more competitive side of esports or gaming. And I'll put it into 2 main categories. 1, lack of execution variance. 2, lack of discernible depth. And I'm going to explain what I mean by both of those terms. First, lack of execution variance. In most arena fighters, the popular ones at least, this being Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm, One Piece Burning Blood, that One Punch Man game that's about to come out, the My Hero game, any Dragon Ball game before Fighters, and a bunch of others that I probably can't think of right now. Combos are done with one button. There's one button, you mash the button, and your character does a bunch of different stuff, right? In Storm, you can tilt the stick up or tilt the stick down, and there will be some differences, but not enough to make a huge gameplay difference in variance. The characters don't feel different from each other from an execution standpoint. Maybe there are different things happening on the screen, but I could literally pick up any character in Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 4. As long as I know how to play the game, I can play any of the characters generally without issue. If you can play your game, right, with only one face button and feasibly still win, there's a problem. That's just the truth of the matter, and that's the situation with most of those games. That's the reality of it, right? Because not only do the games do a lot of stuff for you, like they auto-link all combos for you. All combos are auto-linked. In fact, some games even have like you press a button and the character starts moving towards the opponent just to prep for a combo. It's issues like that that really bring the lack of execution variance into play. Also, like I said, execution variance being that each character plays exactly the same from the last character, and the second one is lack of discernible depth. Notice the word discernible. I'm not saying that the games do not have depth. I'm sure that most of those games, if you really dig into it, there are some advanced mechanics and techniques that, you know, somebody who spent, 20 hours playing the game figured out, right? My point is that the depth is not discernible, which means it's not visible to someone watching the game, or from a surface level, or even explained, right? So while some games have tried to mitigate this a little bit, in most scenarios, there's not really a great strategy for approach, right? You're not thinking about concepts like the neutral game, mix-ups, movement. You're just kind of rushing at your opponent, putting on an attack and hoping that it works, right? Like, there's no concept of a high-low block, right? If you hold block, you can just hold block, right? Besides getting grabbed in some of the games, but like if you hold block, you can block, right? So that's an issue that I think really pulls back from the future of arena fighters in a competitive sense. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and just trash talk games, because that's not what I do. That's not who I am. And that's not what I want this channel to be about. All I'm saying is I want to have a constructive conversation about game design and what I think could take these games to the next level. Why is this happening? Why are games designed like this? Why do developers and producers continue to allow these mediocre one-button slap fests to hit the market? Because people buy them. The reality of the situation is that those games are designed with what I like to call feel-good gameplay in mind. It means that you want anybody, including a 6-year-old or a 18-year-old or whoever, that doesn't really play games seriously to just sit down, grab the controller, start mashing buttons, and have a good time. And yes, those games generally achieve that purpose. However, that hinders something else that the game could potentially have, which is lifespan. Right? If I can just mash a button, eventually the feel good of mashing the button goes away. Sometimes it happens really quickly, sometimes it doesn't, right? All I'm saying is that eventually, a couple months, 2 or 3 months, 6 months, maybe even a year if you're lucky, your game stops feeling like fun, generally, right? You run into issues of people just doing whatever, whenever, right? So it's not a good time. Another reason, or this reason ties back into the first one, but is that in most cases, these arena fighters are licensed properties. What do I mean by licensed properties? It means that it's a game where the characters come from some existing property, like anime, TV show, something of that caliber, comic book, whichever, where you already have some kind of attachment and familiarity with the characters. So if the character doesn't feel as unique or expressive when you're playing them, it doesn't really matter, because you still see on the screen what you familiarize yourself with before even putting the game in your console or opening it up on your PC. So we've talked about the issues. We talked about what's going on. We talked about the problems that we see. But what exactly do we do here? What is the approach? Let's talk about some exceptions to the rules that I've said so far, or exceptions of situations of games that don't end up at EVO, or have ended up at EVO, or that are exceptions to the rule of arena fighters are not competitive or fun. First, we have Pokken Tournament. Bandai Namco teams up with, I can't remember the team that did some of the development on the game. But essentially, I mean, in Germany, the game is called Pokemon Tekken. So that tells you already a lot that you need to know. However, the game doesn't play like Tekken at all. Some of the moves, similar. In appearance, yes. But the gameplay mechanics, very different. And the game does very different things from what Tekken does. In Tekken, yes, it's a 3D plane. Like I said, you can move left to right freely, usually. Sidestepping takes a little bit more finesse. Or sidestepping freely takes more finesse, right? And it's still mostly a 1v1. You're looking at your opponent almost all the time type situation, right? With, I mean, some instances of being behind your opponent or whatever, but in most cases, the body is still like parallel. Bodies are still parallel to each other, right? In that instance, you're not getting a situation of a character running sideways while this character standing here looking at them. That's generally not happening. Pokken has this, actually. So Pokken, kind of a weird game in my opinion, but I love it. I'm a big fan. Has two phases of gameplay: the field phase and the duel phase. The field phase kind of acts like the arena fight, the general arena fighter that I was talking about. And while there's still frame data and competitive aspects to the field phase, in reality, the field phase is just the appetizer to the duel phase, which takes more on the play of the traditional 2.5D fighter. You can't, in the duel phase, you can't move into the foreground and background. All you can do is move left and right and jump. So, and that's the situation where most of your crazy combos, lengthy crazy combos, are going to be happening, with field phase just being a situation where you can gain advantage over your opponent. Right? You're not, I mean, you want to put your opponent in disadvantage at all times, sure, but in field phase, you're not really looking to get off a combo, right? In most cases, you're looking to put the game into put pressure on your opponent and put the game into duel phase in an advantageous state for yourself. The next game is the City of Final Fantasy. The City of Final Fantasy is an interesting case, right? Because the game, by Square Enix, was designed as more of an action game than a fighting game, even though technically it's an arena fight. Dissidia actually allows probably the most amount of movement in any fighting game ever, simply because you can move forwards, backwards, left, right, up, and down. Like you can move up and down. You can jump into the air, and you can, mostly with dodges, but you can dodge left, right, up, down, right, and backwards, I think, which creates some variance, some mix-up situations, and some things like that. The caveat of the game is that you have all these Final Fantasy characters, and it was a great experience. So I've named these two exceptions. Where are they now? What happened? Why didn't they work? With Pokken, the reason the game isn't main stage at EVO still today is simple, actually. Pokemon World Championships happen every year. In fact, the recent one was a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weekends ago, and Pokken was there. Showed up every year since its release. But the reason it's not showing up at EVO is mostly circumstantial. Pokken Tournament is a fighting game based on Pokemon characters, which means that Nintendo, who owns the rights to Pokemon along with the Game Freak and the Pokemon Company, is only going to allow Pokemon type games to exist on Nintendo consoles. When Pokken was developed, it was developed for arcades in Japan and did pretty well over there for a little while, I guess. And then there was a console release on the worst console ever made, the Wii U. Now, the Wii U did have some minor success, but in my opinion, most of that success comes from dedicated Smash Brothers players who bought the Wii U just to play Smash Brothers. So in that instance and case, you're not really going to go out of your way to play this very different game that you have no familiarization or kind of attachment to. The Wii U killed Pokken in the earliest days. And yes, while there has been a Switch release for the game, and it did pretty well, I think the hatchet's already been buried. The body's already in the ground, covered in dirt. I mean, yes, Pokemon Tournament DX is nice, but it's not a new game. It's just a port. It's a port of Pokken Tournament released on the Switch. And people bought it. It's great, but it doesn't bring in new players the same way that a new game does. So because of that situation, Pokken is where it is now. People still play it, people still love it, but that situation of the console thing kind of really messed with it. The second thing is that a lot of people who tried it have said things like, the game's not sure what it wants to be. And I don't completely disagree with that notion. I think that the fact that the game switches back and forth between dual phase and field phase does make it unique and gives some characters more or less use depending on the situation, and the new tournament format of 3v3 really brings in a new element of freshness to it as well. However, it's not completely wrong to say that because the arena segments just kind of feel almost tacked on to the overall game, and that the dual phase is where the magic is really happening. And with the City of Final Fantasy, the problem was a lot deeper. So for the PSP title, the first sentence says it all. Actually, so it says part of it. It was on the PSP. While that was a great device, I loved my PSP until the day it fell apart. PSP controls aren't really optimized for extended periods of play. I mean, yes, the device lasts for a while. My point is that if you have big hands or really little hands, they're gonna cramp holding that thing all day. On top of that, tournaments are hard to hold on PSPs. I mean, sure, you can technically have them, but like, who's gonna stream from a PSP? You know, that's kind of my thoughts on that. And then we have to get deeper into the game to figure out some of the other problems. First, the original Dissidia, and I believe the second one, Duodecim, feel more like action RPGs because you can equip different moves and different equipment and different add-ons and things that make your characters different, and there's lots of variants, so you can put your character your way, which unfortunately without regulation kills the game from a competitive standpoint, right? If anybody can have any variants of any character, then it's very hard to prep or practice against that, which means the game is not very competitively sound. And that's usually from a fighting game perspective. This does not apply in other competitive games. But in a fighting game specifically, the more variance there is, the more you have to learn. And once you get to a certain amount of learning that has to be done, the game becomes almost impossible to play competitively, especially with how much variance there can be to an individual character versus a roster variance, which is why things like custom moves, which were initially allowed during the early competitive meta of Super Smash Bros. Wii U, were very quickly kind of shoved out the door because it just got too crazy. And the City falls under the same blanket. Now, a couple years ago, the City of Final Fantasy NT was announced, the arcade game. So this was Square trying to maximize the idea and take it more to a competitive space in life, which I was very happy for and down for, but there were some other problems that kind of came out of this. The biggest one is that Square, for some reason, decided that they would prefer a 3v3 game than a 1v1 game, and leads to situations that are not fun to watch or look at. And so, because of that, the game, the City of Final Fantasy NT specifically, is competitively dead right now. And yes, if you're a big fan of the City NT and you play it every day and you play 10 hours, you're watching this video, sorry if I hurt your feelings, but the reality of the situation is that nobody's playing it and nobody hosts tournaments for it. You want to know why? Because you have to have 6 consoles just to have a tournament. That's one. 2, the game, because it's 3v3, in my opinion, is too chaotic to be considered a fighting game, honestly. Like, there's too much outside of the space of your control that has to go right for you to win. Now, there are tournament variations on Smash Brothers, for example, like doubles, right, where you play another person, but it's a 2v2 situation, right? This is a full 3v3 situation. The arenas aren't massive, right? And sometimes you even get just the frame rate dropping out the game and other issues that just kind of take people out of what made the City the first and the second game so good in the first place, right? The freedom of movement that existed in the original games is still kind of there, but the game is just so different in ways that fans weren't really looking for that game's kind of dead in the water too. One thing I will credit all these games we talked about for, though, is presentation. Now, Naruto Story games are button mashing button fest, but they look really good. Like, really, really good. Like, from a graphical perspective. The presentation. It's all great. The One Punch Man game that's about to come out looks great. My Hero One's Justice kind of looked okay. One Piece Burning Blood looked great. Right? But the problem is that you don't just need good looks to sell a game, which is really ironic considering that some of the games that haven't done so well these days they play great, but the presentation is just, I mean, So, what do we do? What's the fix? What do I propose that the first arena fighter needs to have to take it to the next level? It's simple. Well, simple, but not easy, right? 1, you have to have, in my opinion, it needs to start with the licensed property, because you need people to subscribe to the idea of buying this game before it's even sold, right? So you have to get people in, you have to get people excited, right, for the game. It has to be a licensed property. 2, the game has to be designed with freedom of expression in mind. What I mean is that each character should feel different from the next character over. That's all I'm saying. I should not be able to pick up anybody in the roster and just start mashing buttons and have a good time. That's not how it should work. Maybe have an auto combo. I don't know. Like, I'm not a game developer yet, but what I'm saying is that there needs to be some kind of gameplay design element that allows freedom of expression. What I would suggest is 2 main things that could really take an arena fighter to the next level. 1, freedom of movement. And when I say freedom of movement, I mean cancels. So, games that have cancel mechanics really get crazy sometimes, and that craziness is usually welcomed by the community that plays those games, because there's so much variance and expression of freedom that comes from being able to cancel anything you're doing into something else, right? And some of these games have had cancels, Naruto, but they weren't that good. I mean, yes, they're good for the case of the game, but they're not. It's not freedom of expression. Like, you're just pressing 2 buttons, you get a cancel, and then you just repeat the same auto combo you just mashed a couple seconds ago. That's not freedom, right? But what I'm saying is, when I think of cancels, and I think of the freedom of cancels, I think of the Guilty Gear Roman cancels, and I think of the focus attack dash cancels, the FADCs for Street Fighter 4, and I think of the counter attack dash cancels for Pokken Tournament. Now, I think that game in particular had the closest thing to what I'm looking for, or would say, but combine it with more Street Fighter 4, remove the whole counter aspect to it, and now you have a really interesting mechanic. Imagine being able to move around in a complete 3D space. You can run, you can dash, you can cancel your dash into another dash that goes in any other direction. So you can move forward, cancel it to a backward dash, cancel it to a jump, cancel it to a left or right dash, cancel it to a diagonal dash. You're talking complete freedom of movement, right? And so this the same thing could be applied to combos, right? You're doing a combo, you cancel the combo to a dash to cancel the recovery of something to combo to something else that maybe has more startup. Like things like that would really kind of elevate the game to a higher level of play. The second thing is, please let there be more than one attack button. Now, some games have done this. Not gonna knock down the ones that did. Pokken, Burning Blood at the top, the ones that jump to my mind, and technically Final Fantasy, because there's the bravery attack and the HP attack, and they do different things. But I'm thinking more of a traditional light, medium, heavy type situation. And while 2D fighting games usually have more of a, like, there's a purpose for having a light attack, a jab that comes out quickly, right? Because it's very safe. The amount of space that you have in a 2D game is not the same as you have in a 3D space. So even though the jab is very small and safe, you can still hit your opponent with it because sometimes there's nowhere for them to run. With the arena fighters, that's not really the same situation. So maybe instead of a space type situation, it's more about damage and recovery, right? Focus more on that aspect of what makes the difference between the light, medium, and heavy attack, and then combo scaling as well, right? Which is, I think, Dragon Ball FighterZ has done a pretty good job of like figuring out, like, okay, you can start a combo with the light attack, right? But then the combo scales a lot more, so that kind of changes neutral, because now some characters that maybe don't do as much damage, if they have good jabs, they can still do enough damage to be considered viable characters. And so what I'm saying is that in an arena fighter, you can have a situation where there's more than one attack button, or permissibly a light, medium, heavy, maybe a jump button, and then have a trigger or something assigned to a dash cancel, whatever, right? And the third thing actually would be no auto combo links. Now, I'm not saying to remove auto combos altogether. I'm saying that I should not be able to mash a button. Right, you should know your character's frame data, things link it to certain things. So maybe you have a 3-hit auto combo or something, or maybe a 2-hit auto combo with the light button. Then you have maybe a 2-hit auto combo with the medium button, and like no auto combo on the heavy button. I don't know. I'm not designing the game right now. I'm just speculating. I'm just saying what would be interesting, what would be cool to have. The idea is to make the game exciting, to make it interesting, have variance. Also, mix-ups. In fighting games, a mix-up is a situation where a character or opponent has to guess what you're going to do, and based on their guess, determines on whether they win or not. A really good mix-up makes you guess lots of times in a very short amount of time to mix you up. That's why it's called a mix-up. Arena fighters currently don't have mix-ups, right? They just don't. They really don't. Like, because in most cases, you attack head-on, and your attacks don't have any variance in hitbox properties, which means that if I'm attacking you, you can just stand there and block, and you'll block every attack I throw out until maybe your shield breaks or whatever. But what I'm suggesting is that in a situation, if it's a 1v1 game, right, maybe pressing left while pressing an attack does a left attack, and pressing right while doing attack does a right attack. And it's maybe instead of just a neutral block, there's like a neutral block, a left block, and a right block, you know? So a neutral block will block head-on attacks, but the left attacks and right attacks have to be blocked with the left or right block. I'm not saying that's 100% what people should do. I'm just saying it's an idea, and developing around that idea, I think, will create more variance and more beautiful situations as well. So what's the point of this video? What are we trying to take away? I've complained a lot today. I've made a lot of suggestions. What do we want to do with this? Maybe 50 to 100 people watch my videos, right? Like, yes, I don't have a huge audience. This is just a discussion. And yes, I will probably make games someday. Just put that out there. And yes, fighting games are on the list of things that I would like to make someday. So if I ever get to that point, trust me when I say that an arena fighter is on the horizon. I'm just saying that if any other developer out there sees this video, remember who to call and thank when your game gets EVO main stage, because I was the one that told you how to take your game to the next level. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. See you guys next time.